Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Todd Rossnagel, the Director of Communications for the Louisiana Conference. It is so glad that all of you could be with us as you begin to pour in. This is our third and final webinar with our friends from Project Curate. Today's session is entitled Blackness 101 and Anti-Blackness. And so welcome. We thank you for carving time out of your day to be with us. We hope you took some time earlier today to watch the funeral service for Congressman John Lewis in Atlanta, Georgia. Completed a week of memorial services for the longtime lawmaker and civil rights icon, willing to fight and to get into trouble, necessary trouble. So we thank you for hopping over here and to be a part of our work together. Our panelists today are, as we said earlier, from Project Curate, a nonprofit that works with religious and community organizations to support collaborative responses to issues of injustice and inequality. We will get to the introductions in just a moment. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, your mics are muted and your cameras are off. This is for the express purpose of focusing on the panelists and our content and keeping distractions at a minimum. Second, you will notice that, that we have a poll question that we are launching right now. The poll is a simple question. Do you desire to have further conversations? Would you like to continue these conversations? We are exploring what that might look like in a format where we can see one another and talk to one another as a family, as a conference. If you would like that, if you would like to go deeper with this content, please vote yes. And we would first like to gauge interest in that. So we'd like your participation in that poll. Also, if you'd like to serve as a host for a potential breakout room in those, please message me in the chat. I will mark your interest and take a tally of those who may want to serve as hosts. And finally, we want your questions. We talk about this every week. Don't be shy. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our questions will guide our time together, and we'll get to those throughout today's session. Now to our panelists, we are joined today by Brandi Holmes. Brandi felt compelled to leave her successful corporate career 6 years ago, and she focuses her work now on various Black liberation struggles, especially the struggles of Black girls and women, and she is a noted social activist, community organizer, and strategist dedicated to policy and criminal justice reform. Also joining us will be Dr. Biko Mandalay Gray, who is an assistant professor of American Religion Studies at Syracuse University and a community advocate. Dr. Gray's research interests operate at the intersection of religion, embodiment, and subjectivity, all of which cohere around a central question: if we took our bodies seriously, how might we think of our relationship to ourselves, others, and the world? And we also have Reverend Dr. Cleve Tinsley, co-managing director of Project Curate. Dr. Tinsley is a scholar of religion and Black studies. He earned his MA and PhD in religion from Rice University. He is a Baptist minister who holds a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. He has extensive experience as an organizer, institution builder, manager, and consultant for churches and community organizations. And finally, our bishop here in Louisiana, Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey, joins us as she has since the very beginning. Bishop Harvey also serves as president of a council of bishops for the United Methodist Church. All right, Bishop Harvey, she will start us off with a brief word and a prayer. Bishop Harvey, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so good that we all gather back here again, and you've done this, some of you, week after week over the last 3 weeks, and for that I am very, very grateful. This is important conversation. It's critical conversation as we begin to at least open the door to a conversation about anti-racism and who God has called us to be in this important work. Like many of you, I've been trying to catch snippets of John Lewis's service, and I was fortunate enough to catch most of President Obama's eulogy, and it was uplifting and certainly convicting in many ways, and an appropriate prelude, perhaps, the whole service was to our conversation today. So I thank you again for being here. I'm going to open us with a word of prayer, and then I'm just going to let these folks lead you through the next about an hour or so. But be sure to respond to the poll if you haven't already. I don't know if it's finished. I think it's still in progress. And also, we just want to be able to continue this conversation and want to know whether you would be interested in deepening this conversation. It likely will have to be via Zoom because we can't meet in large groups yet, but perhaps in a Zoom where we can see one another's faces and do a little bit more dialogue, so smaller groups. And we're also asking if you're interested in helping host one of these, it would be great to know. So just, you can let Todd know in the chat, or you can email any of us, but we want to be able to have several of these throughout the conference so that you can enter into deeper, more direct conversations with colleagues. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Gracious God, on this day when we celebrate heroes of the cause, and in many ways heroes of the faith, like John Lewis, who initially wanted to be a preacher, and perhaps he lived his life as a preacher, embodying the good news, embodying the gospel, bringing forth these injustices to all of our lives, and certainly fighting for justice. So today we give thanks for his life, and the life that's celebrated today is a life well lived and a legacy, oh God, that we know that you are asking us to continue. So for his life, we thank you for giving him to us for even just 80 or so years of his life. And oh God, we come to you as faithful followers of Jesus, your faithful followers who want to do the things that you call us to do in order to take a stand against racism and all the other injustices that we at our baptism said that we would resist evil and oppression and injustice in whatever form or shape that it takes. So help us live up to that call. Help us to live into that call. For you have called us your children. May we be faithful to the work that you put before us. For this and these that gather today, we give thanks. Amen.
All right, so our friends from Project Curate, I'm not sure, Dr. Tinsley, I think maybe you're going to go first. Is that right?
Yes, I'll start us off.
All right.
So first, it's good to be with you today. My understanding that you've had at least exchanges, or I've heard from my prior colleagues. What I like to do is do two things in my remarks. One, set a frame for how we'll have this discussion, and then talk more practically about why the moves are necessary. First, a word about my colleague Brandi Holmes. In addition to everything Reverend Todd said, she also serves as one of our co-managing directors as well. And as Biko also will highlight, a large part of the work around which we do is centered on her work and her acumen as well. So I want to make sure I acknowledge and say that up front as well. We want to start this conversation by first recognizing that this conversation we're going to have with you, or really the dialogue, as much as to the extent we can have one, requires a different approach, right? Many folks talk about racisms and injustice, but not many folks talk about anti-Blackness or Blackness itself. Now, one might ask the question, why a conversation about Blackness and anti-Blackness? Because they are not one and the same. And in the brief time that we have with you this afternoon, it's impossible for us to really tease out the significance of those categories. Yes, we all would contend that anti-Blackness is a rudiment of white supremacy. It is the foundation upon which power in this nation has created a racial capitalist structure. But again, we don't have time to break all that down. We'll begin to talk about some of those terms and why it's important. But more importantly for us is to talk about how those things also configure why it's more necessary to have conversations about the nature and meaning of Blackness itself. Within that, you might hear terms like Black joy or Black pride. We're familiar now with stuff like Black Lives Matter movement. We celebrate John Lewis as being a relative hero in our culture. And a lot of the civil rights movement, human rights issues have centered around the agency of Black queer folk, Black women, and who have gotten most lauded oftentimes is Black men. But at this moment, my colleague and I, Biko, actually were asked to contribute to Georgetown University's Berkeley Center about what is the proper religious response at this time. What do clerics or those who think about religion, what's the proper response to the recent uprisings of racial injustice and the heightened attention? And in my piece, I kind of pointed out that we can't ignore that this attention that has been brought to this issue now is because of three connecting issues. One, yes, there's the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others who have not been mentioned. But at the same time, we're in a COVID pandemic, which causes folks for the first time, for many, to be still and to look at all of the wide ranges of oppressions that this moment highlights. But also for some folk who are more vulnerable, the economic downturn, the kind of injustice as it relates to access to healthcare, as it relates to housing insecurity, as it relates to infections and deaths, as it relates to this pandemic, bring together kind of concurrent of things that makes this moment all the more necessary for those who are religious practitioners. And here I'm talking to you as one myself, to think about what our approaches should be in this moment. In that piece, I said something about churches in general. One, I think one of the significant ways and strategies that we can deploy in this moment relates to our history, right? There has been a history, both positive and negative, but I'll highlight the positive aspect of how churches have always been involved in struggles for racial justice and equality. Have not done it so well as it relates to our queer populations and others, but at least as it relates to this, there have always been some types of robust partnerships. And one thing that remains from this long history is the power of convening. Today you are here, why? Because of an institutional arrangement. A bishop calls you, there's a structure that enables you to engage with ideas where folks come to you. We shouldn't take that power for granted. We still will have the ability for folks to come, because the truth of the matter is a lot of folks who are listening to us now would not come if you were not a part of this conference. You would never hear from a Biko, you'd never hear from me or Brandi if it were not for this what? Convening. So we shouldn't not appreciate that as well. But there are also two aspects about religious responses in churches that I think needs improving. One, we've not done a good job of doing what we call community building and organizing. Yes, we do a good job of building insider groups, right? But what we don't do is a good job of building even amidst communities that we claim to be in solidarity with. Most of our appeal to them is to come to us on our terms. And so their interests and needs become secondary to our proselytizing interest on a respect. But then we haven't done a good job of community organizing on top of that. Now, community organizing requires a different kind of skill set. It requires the ability to translate our ritual practices, the symbols we use, the narratives, and to engage in what we might call a critical exchange with folks who are different, folks that we have othered, folks who we might say are our neighbors, but typically that term that seems to be a pejorative term among white progressives at first. When you say neighbor, you're meaning those other folks who are not like me, but I'm gonna deign myself to go service them in some way. I may move into their community, right? But when I think of neighbor, I'm not thinking of somebody who is like me, I'm in solidarity with. No, this is just my act of service. And so there's those three things that I argue in this piece. One, we should use the power of convening. We need to do a better job of learning how to build community with others and also organizing. And a key aspect of organizing, I argued, was engage in a critical exchange. And what does that mean for you? I'd like for you for a moment to try to suspend the kind of stakes we have in the ground, right? The theological orientations and things we would willing to go to die for, and say, what does it mean for me to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't speak in the same type of rhetoric I speak in, right? What does it mean for me to observe that I am a community of language, but everybody doesn't know what it means, quote unquote, to be saved, or quote unquote, to kind of come to the cross, or come to go to say, Jesus is my savior. How then I do not engage in conversation stoppers. And that's what we're going to do with you today. At the end of this, we're going to come back to make sure it's more practical, to talk about what can we do as religious practitioners to do that. But before that, we admit to you, we're trying to, in 2 hours, engage in really what took a lot of us 10 years to engage in a critical conversation about what not only racism is, but how anti-Blackness and Blackness itself is a category that needs to be addressed. Because my key argument and what I wrote in the piece was simply this: no longer can we have just a neat conversation about racism where we allied the tough conversations about the salient reality of Black death. Because amid the specters that are causing all this death in the world, we can't ignore the fact that to be described, so to quote unquote, as Black in the US means you already have a death-dealing circumstance that you have to navigate in the first place. And so we're going to get more into that today, bring it back around to being practical to you. But I just wanted to open up by saying this: you can't have a conversation about racism. You can't talk a conversation about injustice without talking about anti-Blackness. And on today's forum, we're not talking about Black and brown. We may talk a little bit about indigenous, but we're talking about along this spectrum of injustice and how this country was built. You can't ignore the fact that Blackness is always at the bottom of this register. But we're going to talk about it in your terms as well. So I want to turn over now to my colleague, Biku, who's going to talk about Blackness as a kind of atonement as it relates to this. And like I said, don't worry, it's going to be complex for you in the beginning, but in the end, we'll bring it back around to talk about why it was the need for us to talk about these categories large writ. And I'll yield her now to my colleague.
So it's good to be here too. I think it's easiest if we stay close to this particularly religious register. So instead of us talking about France Fanon or the Afro-pessimist tradition, instead of us getting caught up in the discourses that actually articulate very clearly, historically and empirically, what anti-Blackness and Blackness is, I thought it would be good to just stay in the religious register. And so what I wanted to do is to think about, to help you all to understand the depths of anti-Blackness, what it means to be anti-Black. I decided to write a piece or write part of a piece and then share a bit more to clarify this for you. I want to be very clear. What I mean here is that anti-Blackness in the United States is a form of atonement. I will say that again. Anti-Blackness in the United States is a form of atonement. That means that someone is saved because Black people die. I will say that one more time. Someone is saved because Black people die. So I'll read part of a piece, and then I'll turn actually to my Berkeley piece too, Cleve, because I think it's relatively useful here. I'll read just a few lines from something that I'm working on. They came for him. They criminalized him. They subdued him. They suffocated him. His lungs were giving out. His arms began to weaken. His eyes started to close. His voice was giving out. The community heard him cry. The community watched him die. No one did anything. No one could. He died. He died slowly. He died publicly. His name was Jesus. I want us to think about, and I want to stay just briefly, because I hope you all heard all of those lines. And if you cannot hear the resonances between Jesus's own passion narrative and the narrative of George Floyd, the fact that both of them died publicly, slowly, and their community is in large part unable to do anything other than watch this violence occur because someone else is being saved. I want us to think about what that means in terms of your own work. My job as a philosopher of religion is not to get into the practical stuff. We'll get there. But right now, the job is to provide some kind of intellectual edifice. So the first thing that I want to make very, very clear when we think about anti-Blackness as an atonement theory is that it is a zero-sum game. Number one, zero-sum game. Somebody wins because somebody dies. That is the most important thing that people can understand. The second thing that people need to understand is that anti-Blackness exceeds intention. Let me say that one more. It exceeds intention. So we can't assume that anti-Blackness is simply articulating a particular racial invective, uttering a certain kind of slur, right? Anti-Blackness is, as Jared Sexton tells us, woven into the grammar of the West, such that anti-Blackness is the air that we breathe. And anti-Blackness is the air that sustains white life. And it is the very toxic air that engenders Black death. And if you don't understand why I'm talking in this way, I'll read just a bit of what I had drafted for the Berkeley Center. This isn't the first time that we've heard "I can't breathe." This is why I say it exceeds intention. Anti-Blackness exceeds intention because only now are we now having what appears to be, in many people's eyes, a reckoning about anti-Blackness within the context of the United States. But 6 years ago, July 27, 2014, we saw another man get choked out on camera. We saw another man be suffocated, and churches specifically, mainline Protestant white churches, said that was a tragedy, but it was not something that was particularly worth the sort of nationwide reckoning that we have right now. My hunch is, the difference here is that this one seems to be so blatant that people cannot divorce themselves from it. Why am I saying it that way? Because it was anti-Black for people to do nothing in 2014. And what has happened now is the assumption is that people are doing the right thing in 2020, but you've had such a legacy of anti-Blackness for at least the past decade. And so we have to think about that post-intentional reality. The last thing that I'll say before I sort of turn this around is that atonement is a theodicy. For those of y'all who don't know what that word is, make it very, very basic. It is essentially a way of justifying the goodness in the face of insurmountable evil. The question is, if God is so good, why do people suffer? And theodicy answers that question. And what we see within the context of the United States, and this is where I will end for now, because I think it's important for us to turn to things that are much more concrete. What we see within the context of the United States is that anti-Blackness has become a theodicy for white people and white communities. In other words, killing Black people has become the justification for the goodness of white people, the goodness of the United States, in the face of what can only be understood as insurmountable evil. If you don't believe me, consider the ways that people were described, and consider the ways that people are still described within the context of the United States now. Michael Brown was understood to be a thief instead of a victim of being shot. Jonathan Ferrell, who you may not know, was killed by cops in North Carolina in 2013, I believe. He was shot 12 times because they said he ran through tasers. The officer got out on a hung jury. Alton Sterling was called a devil by Blaine Salamone. He was shot 6 times, 3 and then 3 more. And at the end of the day, he was called the devil. Blaine Salamone called him a devil. Blaine Salamone never went to jail. Joseph Weekley accidentally, quote unquote, shot Ayanna Stanley Jones. He said it was an accident. He is out free. Timothy Loman shot Tamir Rice before the car stopped and said ultimately that he was an adult. And the DA told us that the cop couldn't tell whether or not he was a child or an adult. Why am I bringing up all these things? Because all of these different conversations were justifications of the goodness of the police, which displaced their violence onto the Black bodies that lay in the streets. If you don't understand the religious structure of anti-Blackness in this country, if you cannot recognize that every police shooting is a passion narrative, if you cannot realize that every time someone lays in the streets dead, that we have now seen another crucifixion without a resurrection story, then you have considerable work to do by way of anti-racist work. And this includes, and this is where I'm going to open it up for questions, I believe. This includes questions of symbols, questions of statues, as I believe Brandi's going to talk about, And all of that entire symbolic framework is a Theodicean atonement justification framework that continues to crucify Black bodies in the name of white salvation. It doesn't have to be intentional. You don't have to have killed Jesus in order to be saved by him. I will say that again. You don't have to have killed Jesus to be saved by him or saved by his death. And I'll leave it right there.
Right before we transition to questions, or Todd and Brandi, I just want to pick up on what Biko was saying and talk about anti-Blackness as a form of training, meaning it's anti-Black that we as religious leaders don't have to engage with any Black theologians coming through seminary, but is considered a contextual move in theology. It's also anti-Black sometimes. If you imagine, we say Sunday is the most segregated hour, there's a deep history to that. And even where there are these quote unquote multi-ethnic, multicultural congregations, upon analysis and for observation and participation, what you'll observe is typically there is still one dominant culture really leading. They just have done something called diversity. There's more representation without that, right? And so we as clerics can't begin to start talking about ending inequity and to struggle against injustice unless we're willing to talk about inclusion more robustly, unless we're willing to talk about the ways in which we engage in worship, who we quote as authoritative sources, how we engage in this talking about it. We can't do that without that. Now, Biko just walked us through a very complicated history, deeply laden with philosophical registers that even sometimes we all might miss. But at bottom, what we're kind of trying to say to you all is you can't understand the structure of racism, the structure of inequality and oppression, especially in this country, if you don't start from the struggles and the understandings of Black folk as it relates to that. And I believe here, Bishop and Reverend, we'll turn it over to Paul's for any questions for anything you've heard to this point before we yield to our colleague.
So far, we don't have any questions submitted, so I'd like to encourage everyone in the audience that if you have a question, please feel free to leave it in the Q&A function down at the bottom. I know that there are some questions out there, and please don't be shy. Ask your questions. But maybe now it is a time for Brandi to continue, and we'll take some questions as we continue.
Claire,
I do want to say one comment as well. I want to say to Claire, I agree with you. I think to end the conversation on Blackness and anti-Blackness is a very difficult end. We almost should have began with this conversation when we started talking about racism. That's something we recognize and we'll think through as we continue to go forward. But I agree with you. Ending with such a conversation is very hard to kind of do so. Also, the Biko and I will put links to the articles we wrote for our Berkeley piece so that you'll have that as well.
And just to clarify, the comment from Claire was that we should have started the conversation here. So just to be clear about that, what that comment was and the response to that.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, I encourage everyone to use the Q&A function. So
one just came up.
Yeah. Is there better language that we can use besides diversity or inclusion? It seems to still center white folks and their willingness to participate, probably always be a dynamic of allowing in and keeping out. So some better language that we could perhaps use.
I think what you'll see in justice circles, there's kind of, you hear language about diversity and inclusion mostly with institutional arrangements, but what you see in justice movements are more language around equity, around justice, around these kind of community building. And so you don't see a lot of language around diversity outside of institutional arrangements that really, and it's a clever move if you're not claim. It's both a sincere and sinister attempt, I say. On the one hand, it's an attempt to say, yeah, we need to do better. But it's also an attempt to also say, maybe our doing better is just representational. For instance, there's a conference leader, another conference, nobody y'all know, I won't mention any names, who said, like, we're really about being diverse and inclusive now. And so I happened to log on because I'm new to this deal. And what they meant by that is they showed a Black choir singing, but everything else was the same. right? And so these attempts at inclusion only means a kind of deconstruction work, right? You can't say I want to be inclusive unless you said what we've said in the beginning. Unless you're willing to be inclusive in the songs you sing, inclusive in the persons that you quote as authoritative sources, inclusive in how you read and engage texts, more inclusive in our traditions, right? Unless we're willing to raise some honest critique about the quote unquote church fathers and how that automatically subsumes and oppresses a certain group that comes to your church, then you're not ready for inclusion and equity. And what I tell church leaders all the time is, it's not so much that the population is turned off by the terms in as much as about the effort. Folks will appreciate more if you just said to folk, you know what, we're not ready to go there yet. Like, we're using these terms, but what we're really saying is we're trying to get more diverse at this stage. People will appreciate that integrity up front, rather than saying I'm willing to go all the way, when really we might mean diversity instead of inclusion. So there's a slippage of terms that happen there, but diversity is, I would just say, is about representation, right? It's about saying I got different looking bodies and different people who come here. But inclusion means I'm willing to kind of not only do the rough work of interrogating my ritual practice in ways that make them more liberating and free in how they exist in the world.
If I can add here too, I think this question of diversity and inclusion is exactly what I was trying to articulate by way of my remarks. When you think of diversity and inclusion in terms of representation, ultimately what you do is tokenize and eventually sort of reduce and flatten whoever the diverse person is, or the diverse community of people is, to a static stereotype. Who loses in that conversation? Certainly not the white folks who get to say we have a diverse community. Right? It's actually the folks who turn around who actually have to be tokenized, who have to sort of show up and sing in the choir, for example. And so I think I just wanted to add that this is for me, the language of diversity and inclusion is precisely what we're saying. It's a structure. The language of diversity is a structure of anti-Blackness. I really don't know how else to sort of make that clear, because the folks, as Cleve said, are not being brought in to shift the structures of these particular institutions, but instead to offer lip service to what's already occurring. Again, to justify the goodness of the institution as such, while displacing all of the responsibility on those who are understood as diverse. And so I just want us to sort of, I don't know what the new language is outside of perhaps, as Cleve said, equity. I think solidarity is another question. I also think we may not be ready to go here, but abolition is another term we might begin to think about too. So these kinds of terms get us closer to something that's far more substantive than simply throwing a group of Black people up on the screen and saying we are now diverse, or multi-ethnic, or multiracial, as the new sort of terminology is.
Well, that might be a good segue to this second question that came in, and I'm not sure exactly where you guys are headed, so maybe this is a little bit later in your curriculum, if you will. But the question is, if webinars, what we're doing here today, is a first step toward justice, true diversity, and equity, what are some examples of second steps in this sanctification process?
Yes, so I'll try to address that now, speaking as a practitioner side, right? It involves the construction of new approaches to doing this work, specifically those who are concerned about doing ministry, right? You have to then unite, and really, Brandi actually will be talking more about this as well, about what are some approaches one can take. Churches have to be willing to engage with community organizers, activists, and folks who are not part of my community life on Sundays, and do what BICO is kind of doing here now, challenging us all to engage in further critical conversation about terms, about understanding, and then letting that infuse the culture of who we are. My experience has been that religious leaderships and institutions have often been scared of having the conversations. Why? Because we're forced to then grow in a certain way. We're not comfortable going in territories we're not comfortable with as leaders. If somebody's pressing us to do different language, then in many ways we view that our authority is being challenged, right? And it's the reason why a lot of academics, a lot of activists, a lot of organizers can't converse with one another, because they're scared of the conversations. And by they, I mean us. Those of us who are in the church have been scared to even convene the conversations outside of what we're comfortable with. And so I would say a first start is engaging in different strategies by bringing convenings. The second step is what we're doing at a small church I'm at in Galveston is we're doing different kind of partnership and ministry arms to do that. We're contracting with other justice workers and organizations to create different models of meeting the needs of those most vulnerable on their terms. What does that look like? Going to them, one, being community building and being a presence, but also not engaging in an exchange with them. They have nothing to give us, right? And so what does that do when your bottom line is not about counting butts in seat and thinking about how much I can give back to a conference? Then what does that mean for our ministry strategy? What we found is that kind of work is hard. I'm able to do it only because I've been able to carve out other liberties, right, that enable me to do it. It doesn't require a whole bunch of money and support from the institutional structure to do so. That's a different way of doing it. It's a cutting against the grain, but it's also a way that's not oftentimes supported by our leadership. And that's sad, because the truth of the matter is we have to ask the question, what would Jesus actually be doing in modern times if Jesus were alive? Would Jesus be concerned about sustaining the institutions, concerned about asking questions and figure out who's going to have the largest church that's going to split off on what so we can have the most budgets going on? These are all superficial matters that we as clerics get involved in. Is what actually pushed me to engage in more critical spaces, so that if I was able to come back, gratefully I was, that I'd be able to have more honest conversations about this without my pension being threatened, without me being called in to a special meeting with my bishop because he didn't appreciate how I said something.
We need to get to Brandi. I'm going to respond to this next question just briefly, and then B, we're going to go to you because you have some stuff that needs to be offered. The question from John Tellis was, what do you think conversations about anti-Blackness will cause to happen? I will be frank with you. We have been having this conversation for centuries, and the truth of the matter is that those conversations have been doing only, it depends on your perspective of history, but in my mind, the discourse itself does not really, we haven't seen as much change as we'd like. I'll say it that way. And so in my mind, what these conversations are supposed to do, the reason why I'm here, I will speak in solidarity with both of my colleagues. The reason why I'm here is to be able to say that if you haven't heard it before, you have heard it now. That there is no way, shape, or form that anyone who is not Black and who is white in this country, specifically people who are white in this country, can absolve themselves of the sinfulness of anti-Blackness. That's my job. My job is to be able to show very clearly that no one can say I didn't know. No one can say we couldn't figure it out. Oh my God, it was Brand. My point in all of this is to leave as I leave my undergraduate students. You can go out and act however you want, but what you cannot do after having these conversations and what you cannot do after taking my classes at a university is say, hey, I didn't know. I was confused. Because I've made it very, very, very clear. In the same way, the only difference is we don't get up. That's why we don't compare ourselves to Jesus. But in the same way that the world benefits from Jesus dying, white people benefit from Black people dying, being imprisoned, and being oppressed throughout this country's history. Tom Cotton said it. A couple of days ago, he said slavery was a necessary evil, and the clock is right twice a day. It was a necessary evil for white folks because they would do it again in a heartbeat. And I don't mean to be blunt in that way, but I think it's important that we be clear about what our motivations are. So I don't mean to offend people, but I do think that the goal of prophetic speech is to be honest. And I'd like to be honest with you all.
Thank you, Biko. Building upon some of what Biko and what Cleve shared, I think when we're talking about this particular moment, and this is a question I've been asking myself as one who is engaged in the community organizing space and engaged in working in directly with community, is really the work that this moment requires is for us to continue to do this deep interrogation of self. And I think one thing that Biko has shared is that it was very interesting is this deep interrogation of self requires that we analyze and assess the context of the stories that are being told. In particular, we're hearing stories about, and please excuse my faulty internet from time to time, I may go in and out, but just work with me here. What's interesting is that there's been conversation around criminal justice reform, and there's been language around criminal justice reform and also transformation. And now we're seeing a move toward conversation around abolition, which is imagining a world where police state-sanctioned violence doesn't need to exist. And this moment really requires us to challenge our imaginations and begin to imagine, as Cleve was mentioning, new ways of being and new ways of living into these visions that we have. If we prescribe to the idea of a beloved community, what does it really mean for us to imagine what that means for those who are oftentimes at the bottom rung of these societies? And so I think when we talk about particular context of anti-Blackness and as it relates to the criminal justice system, oftentimes folks will say, well, the criminal justice system is broken. Well, no, it's not broken, actually. It's operating at the full functioning 100% capacity of productivity and efficiency. It's working in which the ways that it's been designed. When we think about particular communities and gentrification, oh, well, there's a problem because these communities are being gentrified. Oh, there's a problem because we're seeing the mass exodus of white folks moving into suburbs or white folks now returning to city centers. That's exactly by design. Redlining is by design. We just have to really interrogate our histories and be very concerned with and do the necessary work to dive into the true stories of what these things mean. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie did a wonderful TED Talk that I encourage you all to listen to called The Danger of a Single Story. And she talks about this in the context of being a Nigerian woman and growing up and just the general assumptions that folks made just based upon what they knew, sweeping generalizations and stereotypes that they made about her as a Nigerian woman, based upon the danger of the single story that they had been told about her. I particularly had an opportunity to spend some time in Louisiana in my corporate life. I actually was there for a couple years, and I was really intrigued by the ideas of plantation as a tourist occasion and tourist site. Deep along the Mississippi River, as you know, there's several different plantations that one can tour. And so I was curious one day. I had a little bit of time after I was finished with work. Actually, I didn't have time. I just broke early from work. But anyway, I had a little time breaking early from work, and I decided to take a bit of a tour along one of these plantations. And it was recommended that I visit Laura's plantation because Laura's plantation was actually a plantation owned by a woman, and to just kind of see what was happening there. So I bit, and I went there. And what was interesting to me is that Laura's plantation told a very interesting story about slavery. It told a very interesting story about the institution. Laura, in many ways, was glorified as a wonderfully ambitious, industrious woman who saw an opportunity to really excel her business and her life for those that she profited from. And the stories and the language that they were using was really interesting. The language they used we're talking about and referencing the slaves, right? And I think it's important for us to even pause here to think about the language that we use when we talk about slavery, right? The condition that folks found themselves were that they were enslaved, right? But when we use the terminology slave, that then allows us to place an identity mark on these individuals, which then further allows us to dehumanize, right? Which then makes it palpable that slavery was an institution that existed in this country, right? When we begin to glorify Laura's story and tell the story of how kind she was to those that she owned, but they were her friends that she cared for. She gave them wonderful clothes. She made sure they had heating in their cabins, right? When you begin to glorify this story of slavery, let's think about what that does to us as a general people when we begin to tell these stories. So I encourage us to think about the language that we use. I encourage us to think about the historical sites and symbols and markers. I encourage us to be a bit disturbed when we notice that a friend or family member chooses to have a wedding at a plantation. What does that really mean? Who's crying out from the grounds of those locations? What voices are being told? What stories can we hear from those moments? I encourage us in 2014, the Whitney Plantation opened its doors. And if you haven't been to the Whitney Plantation, I encourage you to go there. It's back open. I believe they're offering socially distanced tours. And also just the resources available there are online are just phenomenal. And the Whitney Plantation did something that was really marvelous, which is toss this entire tourist industry of telling the story of slavery on its head, because no longer did you hear the story of glorification about the plantation owners, but you heard about the individuals who were enslaved on that plantation. And what you learned about these individuals is that they were industrious folks, farmers, kings, queens, writers, doctors, scientists. The ways that they were able to use the knowledge that they had to provide just an extremely innovative approach to the work that they did. These are the stories, these are the love stories that we should be telling about these individuals, right? This is the ways in which we should celebrate and honor these lives, rather than glorifying of the slave owners. To Biko's point, think about the language that we even hear today. When we hear stories and we hear language around the movement for Black lives, that they are rioters, that they are looters, that they are violent individuals. We should ask ourselves, and we should really begin to interrogate, why is this a story being told about these individuals who are merely demonstrating for the sake of wanting to have justice? So I think it's really important for us to think about these things. We hear rioters and looters, and then we also hear in Charlottesville individuals who actually murdered peaceful protesters, that they were very good people. We also watch in the media how those who are simply protesting and present with a sign are being met with extreme amounts of violence, militarization that has now been introduced. But we also see individuals who have AK-47s and are extremely hostile in the face of police, which seem to be able to return safely to their homes with no sort of hostility or resistance met with their presence. Let's ask ourselves these questions. Why is this happening? Who is this happening to? What does this mean for us as a people? What is our response? I even think about this idea of unity, right? The festival and celebration that oftentimes happen. I love Louisiana. I love Mardi Gras. I love everything that goes on along these things. But I feel like it creates this sense of unity because there's this proximity to Blackness and proximity to culture. And yet the allure of this fantasy that creates a kinship, when in reality, we don't really ask the question, what happens to the folks who return to the lower ninth after they come from Mardi Gras? What happens after February? What happens after March? Who are these folks that are deeply affected by the really very real realities of what's happening in these moments? So I encourage us all to begin to really interrogate not only what we think, but also about how we act. In many ways right now, what you were seeing is that folks believe that the pro-Black movement or the movement for Black lives is really an anti-white movement. And that's merely because the pro-Black movement, pro-white movements have always been anti-Black. Yet in this moment, we're seeing the folks basically demanding a call to justice and accountability. Oftentimes what's met in this moment, folks are very confused or concerned, and what we see is silence is the response. Audre Lorde really continues to challenge us to begin to think and go beyond about the idea of silence and about our posture when we assume silence. And she simply states that silence will not protect us. Silence will not absolve us of any responsibility for what is required of each of us in this moment. Silence, even though it won't protect you, silence, you think that, hey, I'm not responding to this, but silence is a response. It's an inactivity. In many ways, it's a complicity. So I encourage us all to think about, as Biko mentioned, that in this moment, I've been really doing a bunch of reading about the prophets, particularly a text that has stood out for me is Isaiah 58, 6 through 14, and then also Micah 6, 8. And in both of those texts, what you really see is folks saying, hey, listen, we're doing this work, right? I'm doing the fast, I'm doing the offerings, I'm doing all the things, and I'm just not seeing it happening. I'm just not seeing it happening. And the interesting piece is these folks are really aligning with a single story, right? The single story that says, hey, I'm out here fasting, I'm out here doing my due diligence, and yet and still I'm not seeing the results. And the text goes on to say, yeah, you're fasting, but you're also oppressing those who you hold dear. Yeah, you're fasting, but you care not to look toward the widow. You care not to look toward the orphan. You fast, and yet you continue to oppress. So these are the things that I'm requiring of you. And so I ask us now, is like, who are the prophets right now? Who are the prophetic voices that are speaking to us today? And what are they saying? Who are these ones that are crying out of injustice in this moment? And are we turning a deaf ear to these individuals, or are we listening? Are we continuing to ascribe and say to folks that, no, I'm out here fasting, I'm out here doing the thing, I'm out here offering, why are these things not happening? Even now, there may be in this moment, some of the things that we're saying to you that may be kind of challenging and maybe go against the grain of what you've heard. Is the posture now to simply say, let me sit in this moment and ask the questions of what can I learn from this time? What are these individuals trying to teach me? Or are you already preparing a rebuttal and responses as to how what we're saying can't be possibly true? I encourage us all to continue to think about that the prophet didn't come to speak a message of comfort to us all, didn't come to speak a message to keep us complacent and to keep us in the space that we are, but they simply were there to awaken folks to the truth, to the peril of their own lives. In many ways, the truth that they spoke were met with violence. In many ways, that my colleagues and I enter into spaces and questions that were asked, rebuttals, opportunities and questions that are framed as if they're interested in us really journeying down this road, but really ask us to even validate our own existence, are in many ways violent. And we have been met with actual violence as well. So I encourage us not to shield ourselves and blind ourselves to these prophetic voices. These are voices that are in the lower ninth ward. These are voices that are in the third ward, in the fifth ward, in the wards of your particular community. These are voices that demand that you not only invite them in, but that you go out directly to meet with these individuals, as Cleve mentioned. The prophet came to disrupt and disorient in many ways and to push us away from comfort and complacency, which tends to be our default mode of operation. I just ask us to continue to listen to these voices that are speaking to us today, even in this moment, because the Lord is requiring of all of us to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with him. And I encourage us all to continue to think about what that means for us in our particular context. And I would encourage you and also say that the appropriate response in this moment is not silence, but for us to begin to do the work of justice. What does that mean? Well, that means being here in this space is a very good first start. It is a very good first start, but you also must continue to do the work of interrogation. You also must continue to do the work of thinking about how can I go out to learn from those who are willing to share, who are willing to teach me. And when I go out into these spaces, recognizing that the teaching that is done by these individuals, these Black bodies, is labor for those individuals, and that is an extreme gift to be the recipient of those things. And I would encourage you to continue to follow the leadership of those in the community, because those who are most affected are the ones who have the solutions to all of the ills that we continue to see that society faces now. So if you're confused about which groups those are, if you ever see the words disproportionately affected, if you ever see the words marginalized, if you ever see the words striking data that points toward, it's going to be Black folks, just like we're seeing in COVID-19. And it really implores us all to begin to continue to think about what work do I need to do now in this moment. Thank you.
I just have to say, yes, that's pretty much, I mean, Brandi, you did that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that publicly.
Well, thank you to all of you. This has been incredibly insightful, and we want to encourage everyone to continue to ask questions through the Q&A feature. And also, I'm pretty sure everybody voted in the poll, but just a reminder of what the poll question is in case you've joined us late. We are desiring to take these conversations a bit deeper. We're so appreciative of the great work from Project Curate to give us the insight that they have over the last 3 weeks. Bishop Harvey and the cabinet are discerning ways that we can, together as a family, have some conversations where perhaps we can talk with one another, see one another. We've heard that from you. And so the overwhelming response has been that you do want to continue those conversations. So thank you for participating in that poll. That was just thank you for that. All right, Dr. Tinsley, we do have a few questions, but they're not directly related to what Brandi said. Did you want to maybe answer some of these? Where do you want to go from here?
I think it's okay to take a couple of questions.
Okay.
I also want to accent Biko as well, and just pause for a minute to acknowledge how profound and insightful Brandi was on that presentation. Really, as I think through everything we said, quite the prophetic challenge. I think, and I really hope people heard the comment and challenge for us to go forward. But yeah, I think I'm happy if my other colleagues are able to take a couple of questions. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, the questions, one of them is about white flight, and It says systemically, there's no discernible remedy for this behavior. Ideas on better ways to engage the church in the life of the community, ways that are proven to be effective in engaging the congregational body. Yeah,
I didn't see
go
that.
ahead.
Let me start with another question that's real simply. Why are most startups done in I guess Protestant churches done in where is that at?
White upscale neighborhoods.
White upscale. The answer to that is quite simple, right? Has to do with resources, right? And also a lot of the organizations from which these pastors or others receive money from have particular interests in particular communities. A lot of folks, for instance, say in the UMC cycle that are funneled out of divinity schools, pastors come out choosing what neighborhoods they want to be in. And we got to think about it. And also we got to think about, especially in mainline Protestant denominations, most of these folks come from elite schools, and they have areas they want to go to. So most of these startups are going to be in preferable areas to them. And when they are these other communities, oftentimes they want to, we carve out particular niches that say, I want to meet a community over here, but everybody's trying to go to areas that kind of like accent with how they've been formed and how they've been trained, right? And a lot of, if you think about other denominations like Baptist Forever, these missionary organizations, they give funding. Southern Baptist churches funding a lot of churches. So a lot of your newer startups are caught up in a larger loop of capitalist structure as well. Where can I not just succeed, but what are my measures of success? And what we've done, sadly, in churches is say measures of success depend upon numbers I can grow, budget I have, what kind of building I can build. And so we're trained and also supported more so by what we can materially grapple rather than kind of the qualitative work that we kind of do in communities. That's why you see most startups in these other areas. And what you see in marginal or vulnerable communities are the flight churches, like was raised in other words. Churches that at one time formidable and prosperous, they've left, and what happens? People get appointed there, mostly folks of color, because the white folks don't want to build in a place that they can't do anymore. So let's send somebody there to fail. And in rare cases where the folks actually are successful, then they will claim as being, hey, look at our great church over there doing that. But they still are often not resourced by our institutional leadership in ways to help them be really robust and practical. And so you see folks who are from these populations struggling, always starting from the back end, trying to raise themselves up on that regard.
As it relates to this question on church white flight, where a congregation leaves a neighborhood that becomes ethnically diverse, it's so difficult to answer that question because it floats. There's too many factors present, to be honest with you. So on the one hand, you're dealing with the sort of general sociological problem of gentrification. Cleve could probably talk to you more about that in terms of what does it mean for the kind of internal colonization that is, internal colonialism that is gentrification, that's going to contribute to white flight, because things are just, white people are moving to what the hippest or the nicest or the best thing is. And whenever you see particularly Black people in a space, all of a sudden that's not the nice place to be. My personal response to this question is actually to reframe it, which is to actually say that I don't know if the goal actually should be, and this is me personally, I don't want to speak for anyone else here, I don't know if the goal necessarily should be that we try to always make the impulsive move to integrate churches. It is very, very, very clear that there is a particular style of worship that happens in Black churches that many white communities are aesthetically allergic to. And it is also the case that there is a particular kind of worship style in white churches that many Black believers are aesthetically allergic to. That does not necessarily, so we have to be careful, in my mind, about moving directly towards uncritical adoptions of integration narratives. The response should be solidarity. That's what we need to be thinking about. So if your church happens to be all white, but y'all are doing the work in the community to ensure that the community is not dispossessed by your presence, I think that's far more effective far more effective than trying to get a couple of Black people to get in there and sing some gospel songs. And so I want to reframe your question away from the, I don't know how we provide answers for the question of white flight. That's how anti-Blackness happens. Anti-Blackness shows up when white people decide that Black people are present, and so they leave. But what we do know is that perhaps one way to respond to this question is to do the work of being in solidarity. I'll give you a couple of like concrete things, and then I'll chill on this. One is a lot of folks, and Brandi touched on this, a lot of the prophetic voices on the ground are calling for the abolition of police departments. They're calling for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. They're calling for a world, and they're pushing us to imagine a world where justice does not look punitive. They're asking us to look for that. And so many responses have been, we need police. When perhaps maybe the response is, how can we envision a world where police are unnecessary? Where we don't have to throw people in jail, where we don't have to punish and imprison people. That's a different, and the truth of the matter is, that's actually, to be fair and to be biblical, I guess, that's the Christological narrative. Jesus dies because of state-sanctioned violence. He destroys property in the name of pushing against surveillance. He demands that his people, the people who follow him, do not engage in this kind of punitive punishment. And so I think we have to begin to think critically about what kind of prophetic speech is coming from the streets, the people who are understood as the rioters and the looters, when in fact, Jesus was a rioter and a looter. He does not turn those tables over and people be like, cool. There's something about that move that was deeply troubling, to the point where the Sanhedrin say he has to go. This is the man we worship. And if you say that you worship that man, then think about the prophetic voices in the streets who are living into that tradition right now.
There's also a point then brought up about then why flight. It may point to the call that both Biko and Brandi made. Then maybe the flight is that maybe they're not concerned about being in solidarity with, right? They're concerned more about their own cloister and their own enclave they want to build. But if you're really concerned about solidarity, not so much about the composition of my congregation, but the work that we do in solidarity with establishing and keeping these structures of wholeness together, I won't leave, right?
And one thing I want to add, in doing this work over the course of the past, 5 or 6 years, I think that what I have learned is that we have got to be comfortable with the fact that folks are going to fly, and we got to look at the roads that have stayed. And what does that mean for us, right? I think that the prophetic voice continues to speak to even those that have flown, but for those that have stayed, I think sometimes we become so fixated on those that have gone that we miss those that are still present. And those that are still present, to me, signal that they're interested in beginning to do work that's necessary to move us toward justice and equity. And even further, a term that we haven't really introduced in this space, which is one that we talk about in community organizing spaces, of liberation, right? What does it mean for the liberation of Black peoples in particular in this conversation? So I would say that, for those who are still present, the work is not necessarily thinking about how can we bring the community into our congregation, but what is the community asking of the congregation, which is what is the community asking of those people who happen to be situated in this particular community. And so I think those are the questions that we then have to ask. And the response to that question should be, the community has asked this of us, and as a congregation, this is how we will utilize our resources in service of and to the community, right? And I think there's a real distinction too that must be made in a conversation we haven't had in this space of charity versus justice work, right? While it's all fine and dandy for us to toss our funds into the community, we must ask ourselves, what are the root causes and systemic issues that continue to make this thing something that we have to continue to pour money into? Because in my world, I imagine a world where we don't need nonprofit organizations. where we no longer require a United Way, where we no longer require a homeless shelter. As we know, there's enough money, because we live in a capitalist society, there's enough money circulating right now in our world to solve many of the problems that a lot of these nonprofit organizations are in the business of solving. And in many ways, a nonprofit organization is in and of itself another industrial complex. We got to start asking ourselves those questions, right? The nonprofit is in the business to keep many of those who are in transient living situations in those spaces. Why do I say this? Well, when they don't offer the ability for someone to be able to receive mail at their location, when they won't let you use their phone on a Tuesday, when they won't let you shower on a Tuesday, you got to come on a Wednesday. You have to begin to ask yourself, hey, where's equity and justice in this model? And so I encourage us to continue to interrogate and in many ways ask questions of these institutions rather than just simply, just like we do in our congregations each Sunday. My hope is that we begin to ask the questions, hey, why is the pastor telling us about this in this moment? Why are we looking at this particular text? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for me? How do I do the work that is now being required of me and that's being shared with me? So I would encourage us to move to that space.
We had a question that was submitted that's kind of a question before another question that was submitted. So follow me here. The question was just heartbreaking, some of this material, the systemic, the institutional nature of things, struggling with how to respond, feel compelled to do something, just don't know what to do. And then we have another question that is wondering the difference between a demonstration and a protest. The question is this: in How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi distinguishes between a protest and a demonstration. A demonstration is organizing people for a short time to raise awareness about an issue. A protest is organizing people for the long-term work of changing racist policies. The question then is, what is the goal of these webinars, what we're doing here today and what we will continue to do in the future? What is the goal? Is it demonstration or protest? And if it's protest, what policies should be targeted? And again, kind of feeding off the question of what do we do next? How do we respond?
I'll go first and I'll use what my colleagues thought. First, I'd back up a bit and say, I'd add to Kendi's distinctions there about demonstration and protest by saying, demonstration also can be just an act of raising awareness of one's existence or one's political stance in maintaining status quo. So for instance, I would consider some rallies that we're familiar with here in Houston where those who are antagonistic against the Black Lives Matters coming out and demonstrating not for the purpose of political change, but for the purpose of representing the status quo and why things shouldn't change. I connote a type of political aspect to protest where it has been a form and tool, particularly of communities who have been historically oppressed, to engage in a kind of political push for radical change. For instance, it's because of protests that many of policies and people's stances on certain things has to change, because these communities, along with relatively conscious allies, join them in forms of protest for difference, is the reason why all these corporate statements are happening now, why it's safer, for instance, for us to have these kind of webinars where you speak specifically about anti-Black racism. Without protest action, this stuff wouldn't happen. I also would say there's a way in which I wouldn't view this webinar as either a demonstration or a protest. I think this webinar is more of the first thing we talked about, engaging in a kind of critical exchange about not only ideals that can move us forward, because, and here I'm leaning into my pragmatism cleaning, our ideas are determinative of our conduct, right? The way I think determines how I act. But if my thinking is cloistered, if my thinking is narrow and parochial and not challenged, even theologically in how I think about things, then I'm going to act in certain ways, namely to maintain my own interests, right? And so we always say it this way: it's not so much that you got to have all the answers, but maybe these things will help us formulate better questions, right? Because if I have better questions to ask, then I'm able to engage in robust conversation, which lead me into more collaborative solidarity relationships with others. It's the reason why we in Project Curate are specialized in collaborative responses. Why? Because it's only in collaboration that my weaknesses become really heightened and the strengths of others become salient as well. And then I'm forced to do something. I'm either forced to run away and get out this thing, or I'm forced to kind of grow and live into this and mature in a way that allows me to function in a more accountable kind of relationship. And what we run the danger of is the reason why our philosopher Royer used to say all religion is a conversation stopper. Because when we throw out the symbol God, oftentimes what we're saying is, listen, I can't talk to you because, listen, I'm saying God called me, right? And what can you argue with when if you say God has ordained this? That's been the move since history. It's the whole reason behind the myth of Ham and the whole reason why these narratives are used to do that. And so I would say, no, these seminars or webinars are not necessarily demonstrations and protests of and of themselves. It may be an active protest for you to participate in it, and your bishop know you're here, right? But I wouldn't say, I'd say more, this is actually a critical move, an important move for me to enter into zones of conversation and challenges in my own formation in ways that can move me forward.
I would say too, to the what to do next question. I think when we start to talk about conversations around justice and conversations about race, somehow we begin to freeze up, right? So I say, what would we do next? Well, it's kind of similar. What would you do next if an Amazon package came and you were trying to figure out how to assemble your new bicycle? Or what would you do next if you're trying to understand how to make a flambe? You would hop on Google and you would say, hey, I want to make a flambe. And you look at all the different videos that are available. You all do this in your daily lives now, right? Like, you want to know how to do a thing. You go on Google and you look toward the resources that are available to find the voices that can give you the solution necessary to solve whatever problem you're facing. So in this instance, don't freeze up, right? Recognize that you're going to get it wrong. I appreciate Rihanna's tattoo that says never a failure, always a lesson. And you continue to move forward into this thing. And so what do I do next? Well, we guided you along this path of, hey, what is the community asking of our particular congregation? What are voices now who don't look like me, don't sound like me, don't come from the space I say? What are they asking for? Biko's already told you, folks are moving toward this 8 to abolition platform, which is saying, hey, we need to defund the police. Folks are saying, we can't defund the police. Well, we defund education. We've defunded mental health. We've defunded all of these other things in our budgets. It's a possibility. So I encourage you to begin to do that type of research. Go online to the Facebooks, go online to the Twitters and all the other social media. They will direct you to places where you can offer up your resources. And I also encourage you to recognize that, hey, showing up for these things and showing up for racial justice doesn't always look like protest and demonstration. Maybe you are a slamming graphic designer. Well, I can tell you from an instance from the work that we do, we can always use free graphic design. Maybe you're an excellent writer. Maybe you have excellent media connections. Think about the resources that are at your disposal. It's not always monetary, right? While that is a big driver and push for some of the work that's done, you've got skills and talents right now that if you sat down, just like you do any other assessment, assess your skills and talents and then inquire from different organizations. Hey, y'all, I know how to do graphic design. I'm willing to design graphics, web design. I'm willing to write. I'm willing to make calls. How can I be of service? And in those ways, those are ways that you can begin to think about what to do next. And what I've shared with you is the posture that you go into this space is not saying, I do web design, y'all's website stinks, let me give you a new website. It's simply saying, these are the services that I have available to offer. It will be helpful for you. I would love to be in service to you in this way. It is a humble posture, right? And not a posture of, I've got all the solutions and I got the answers. Let me come save you. It's, this is what I have to bring. Is this offering acceptable for what you have going on right now at this time? And so I think that's a beautiful way to start. And I would encourage you to take those steps from a personal perspective as to what might be an effective way to get going.
I would just simply echo both of my colleagues. Cleve and I joke with each other because we come from different philosophical traditions. He's a pragmatist and I'm something else. But what I would say is that he's absolutely right. One of the people who both of us deeply admire, Cornel West, says it best. He says, you fail and you fail better. So part of the issue here is that first we have to stop thinking and stop looking at anti-Blackness as a problem to be solved, but an actual existential structure that needs to be addressed. And what I mean by that is that anti-Blackness is a world-forming structure, which means that this world has to change for anti-Blackness to go away. And so what that ultimately means is that all of our efforts here are always going to be piecemeal and partial, but that doesn't mean that we don't do anything. I think Brandi's absolutely right. I'm not a huge fan of Booker T. Washington, but cast down your buckets where you are and go do what you need to do in terms of whatever resources that you may have. Fail and fail better. You will fail. You will be called out. Things will go poorly, but that doesn't mean that you quit. That's what often happens, is that this white ego is so fragile that the first time someone says you messed up, it's like, well, I won't try again. And I think the truth of the matter is that in the same way that we think of sanctification, I know we're not Calvinists here, but I know that the same way that we think about sanctification, there's a process of getting better. We have to think of this work of pushing against anti-Blackness as a process of fighting, of changing the world, literally shifting the structure of existence in order for justice and equity to show itself.
One of the questions that came up just as a follow-up to that, solidarity, true solidarity beyond some liturgy and pulpit swaps, for example. Can you continue thinking out loud about what you are seeing as you imagine that? What are some other examples that are speaking to your heart when it comes to solidarity?
Honestly, I'd yield to our colleague Brandi on that. One is we have clear examples of how that's happened through Harvey, through COVID relief, but I yield to her to talk about how churches can really be in solidarity with communities.
Yeah, and I think I wish there was a way I could link to it. There's a really powerful illustration that a colleague of ours did, Britt Hawthorne. She's on Instagram for those who do social media, and she created like a pyramid thinking about solidarity and kind of the three different levels of possibilities for folks to begin to engage. And in it, she really provides some really beautiful illustrations of what it means to be an ally, what it means to be an accomplice, and what it means to be a co-conspirator, right? And so there's three kind of different levels of conversation around that. I would say for folks, what has been most helpful in our work, even right now, for COVID relief, is we've created a mutual aid network. And what we've really seen is kind of some of the things that I mentioned here earlier, like the solidarity and the mutual aid network. It's not necessarily folks saying, let me go into the community and do a certain thing, but simply saying, hey, I've got resource available to assist. Is this helpful? And would this be something that would be in service to community? So that has meant that some churches have meal programs that they set up. And maybe the church doesn't occupy or use all the different meals. And so now that has become a mechanism where the church has been willing to provide meals to the community. There have been folks that have donated funds. They've done fundraisers around not just on their own money, but bake drives, t-shirt drives, all types of raffles. And what that funding has enabled us to do is to be able to help over 50 families who are facing economic crisis and on the verge of eviction. Because the eviction holds here in Harris County ended at the beginning of last month, and so now folks are on the brink of that, and so that's what being in solidarity has done. And there've been congregations that have assisted in that. Even during Hurricane Harvey, one congregation allowed us to utilize their particular space to receive donations, right? So there's so many different ways that as a congregation that you can plug into different initiatives that are happening. But I would encourage you right now, mutual aid seems to be a really popular thing that's going on. And mutual aid networks are not new, but mutual aid networks, bail funds, these are different ways that congregations can take monetary resources to pour into community. And a lot of these grassroots organizations on the ground are taking that money to then purchase PPE to give directly to families that need it. Which the core message here is that, one, we have to trust the leadership that's on the ground, right? Because that's oftentimes a challenge. Is like, I don't know if I want to trust the leadership that's on the ground, and then provide them the resources necessary that's to do the work, and then get out of the way. Like, don't email and be like, hey, I want you to use my money toward. Give them the funds they need, give them what they're asking for, so they can go out and do the work. And so I think those are some real ways that solidarity can take on action in this time.
I'm not sure how much time we have, but I did want to address three of the questions by doing it shortly, if that's okay, Todd. So I want Biko to come back to someone asked a question about how he doesn't understand how atonement theory is really helpful for anybody. Can you speak more to that? Before you get to that, I want to respond to another question that talked about this idea of manifest destiny and what can we do as to kind of construct these notions. And I think that's where it starts with you, really as white folk, right? You need to have more critical conversation amongst yourself, deconstructing these myths that uphold and undergird the ideas of supremacy as they might exist, and how that sort of suffuses through how you engage in religious practices, for one thing. Another question asked about talking about how Black churches have been refuge throughout history. I'll just point you to resources there. Souls of Black Folk is my favorite go-to by Du Bois, of course, but there are many things out there. Marva Frederick at Harvard has a book about between each Sunday, which is an anthropological text. All these ways in which African Americans have utilized churches not only as deeply places for psychic and spiritual healing, but also as social centers that have been havens throughout history in this country where creative work goes on. Because beyond the shared type of belief system of those who are Black believers, there's also a kind of creative, constructive work that those of us who still identify as Christian see as just as important as some of the medical, physical stuff that might be going on as well. But I also want to give most of our time here to talk for Biko to back up to atonement and help with that more.
I'll just add two other texts to that. There's a text by Lawrence Mamiya and C. Eric Lincoln called "The Black Church and the African American Religious Experience," and then the classic and the one that we I won't say unfortunately, the one that we have to read often is Albert Rabbito's "Slave Religion." Those are two texts that, in addition to the ones that Cleve is giving you the powerful, strong texts. These are the I won't say they're the historical text, and essentially they're giving the articulations that essentially, in a very brief historical survey, that Black churches emerge under being surveilled, but they're hidden away, they're tucked away, and these become refuge spaces. And so, yeah, we can talk about that more in detail. To talk about atonement, very, very, I'm going to try to keep this very clear and also very, very brief. Much of Orthodox Christian theology is structured around the doctrine of atonement. In other words, Adam and Eve did some things that God didn't necessarily approve of, and so there was a debt that was owed. And so Jesus comes to essentially pay that debt, to be the one to essentially be the person whose death pays the debt that is owed by humanity. In other words, the death that humans owe to God in order to be righteous gets displaced onto Jesus so that people can live. That's atonement theory in its most basic form. What we see within the context of the United States is a mutated version of this atonement theory, particularly as it relates to white people and Black people. And this is actually the structure, in my mind, of the West since modernity. So let's think about this. What does salvation actually mean? It comes from the word salve, which means to heal, which is a kind of balm, which essentially, when we think about salvation from its sort of Greek terminology, it's actually talking about being comfortable, being healed, feeling better. When white Puritans came to this country or came to this land, they did two things to make themselves feel better. One was to actually completely destroy indigenous communities through genocidal actions. The other move, and this is what I mean by anti-Blackness being a structure of atonement, the other move was to displace the burden of clearing land and building a nation, displace that debt, displace that equity, that energy onto an entire community of people such that white people could feel better. That's what I mean by atonement. That the burden, the debt gets displaced onto Black people such that white people can feel better. This doesn't end in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln reluctantly and by protest signs a piece of paper. This doesn't end in 1863 because Reconstruction is a very short period of time, and then all of a sudden we're back at it again. Why? Because the northern states make a compromise with the southern states, and all of a sudden we see the eruption of vagrancy laws, of sharecropping, all of these things. What are these particular laws actually doing? They're actually displacing again the burden of developing the land for white comfort and white safety. We saw it happen again when we think about these questions of lynching, so on and so forth. Speed it up to 2014 to 2020. Let's just jump 100 years. We know what happens in the intervening years. One of the things that you notice in the acute situation of these particular killings is that who ends up actually paying for, or who ends up actually taking the responsibility of the evil when people are killed by cops? It is not the police who end up paying the price for doing the dirty work that they do. Mike Brown was understood as an angry demon. That is the displacement of sin onto Mike Brown's body to make Darren Wilson look good. Terrence Crutcher looked like a bad dude. That's the displacement of evil onto Terrence Crutcher's body, such that the white cop, I forget her name, could gun him down with his hands up. Tamir Rice is standing there. He's 5'8", and he says that he looks like he's 18 years old. That is displacing the responsibility, the burden of being an adult onto a 13-year-old boy, such that Timothy Loman could get off. Daniel Pantaleo, who choked Eric Garner out on camera, tells us that the reason why he had to do it was because Eric Garner was quote unquote selling loose cigarettes. In all of these cases, the only people who emerge as innocent are the killers themselves. That's atonement. That's the displacement of one's guilt onto the body of another such that one could be comfortable. That is exactly what Anselm tells us that we do with our theology of atonement in the Gospels, because we don't hang on the cross. Jesus did that for us, and we can live better. We don't, and white people do not bear the brunt of the violence that they enact, because the people who died also are evil after they die. George Floyd is understood as a criminal in certain conservative communities. And so that's what I mean by the structure of anti-Blackness, or structure of blackness as anti-Blackness as atonement. And what this means for those of us who are not acutely and directly involved in these particular things is we end up contributing to that when we say things like, all police are not bad. Why? Because the structure of police is to actually displace the violence and the evil onto Black people so that the country can be safe. We atone ourselves by killing Black folks in the name of public safety. And so when we say all cops aren't bad, or I got a cousin who's a cop, which I have an uncle who's a cop, or I have someone, when someone says those things, they're displacing the violence onto the very people who are being killed. I hope that clarifies. Is that clear? I'm hoping that was clear for whoever asked that question. I think that probably hopefully clears things up.
And I think that also, I think, informs and I think exemplifies the need for us to curate spaces for more critical exchange, right? Because the truth of the matter is, it's hard for that to be clear because it requires us to think of atonement in a totally different register than what one might be called classically trained in, right? That kind of imaginative play is the religious imagination itself, though. And what I would argue is that this is the kind of imagination that happens every Sunday. It happens all the time. We just fail to utilize the full import of that and to use that toward the issues that are pressing and facing us each day. I'm not sure how we are on time, Todd, but I want to make sure I yield here to where we need to be.
Yeah, we had told everyone that we would be a maximum of 90 minutes, so we are nearing the end of our time together. I think I could probably speak for everyone who is an attendee today that there were multiple moments where I stopped and went to my notebook to write something down. This has just been absolutely fantastic. So we thank all three of you, and I know Bishop Harvey wants to thank you and everyone as well. And so we'll send things over to Bishop Harvey for a final word and prayer. And by the way, Bishop Harvey, the results, clearly people want to continue this conversation and go deeper.
Great. That's great news. That's what I was hoping for actually before we ever started this, is that at some point that you all would own this, that Louisiana clergy and laity would rise up and say, yeah, this is our work to do. So when we first had an initial conversation with Dr. Tinsley and Matt, that was where we were hoping that this would go. So I'm very, very glad to hear you say yes to this, and we will continue to rely, and hopefully we've got you on speed dial, Dr. Tinsley, and let Dr. Russell know that we'll get stuck along the way, I am sure, and hopefully that we've developed enough of a relationship here that we can call upon you. Now that we have folks that really want to continue the conversation, I would hope that if you were willing to host as well, that you would let us know, even though this podcast or this webinar will be over. You know our emails. Just let me know. Let Todd know. We will be happy to try to connect those who want to host and figure out how to take those next steps. And I want to do that fairly quickly. It won't be next week because that will probably be too quickly. I want to think this through. But it'll certainly be within the next couple of weeks that we will figure out how to regather. And again, hopefully then that you own this and you take this forward. As I said, that was my hope and my prayer all along. And we want to continue. I've told you that I will not be silent on this, and I'm committed to that. I made that commitment to you. So I will not remain silent. I will no longer be complicit in this. So I need your help. We need your help. We need each other.
We also want to say as a collective as well that both Biko, Rachel, Brandi, all of us want to commend you as a conference, because the truth of the matter is there are not many conferences or any Episcopaes doing this. So all of the clergy who said they want to do it, but more so for you, Bishop, your leadership in creating the space for this is not something that's usual. This is novel in itself, to open up room and the flexibility to have the range of conversation. So you all ought to be commended as well. And the way you had to navigate this, Reverend Todd as well, your skill in doing so, we just want to say to you, we do this all across the country, y'all. And I want to say, especially when it comes to our institutions, religious institutions, there are not many folk willing to press in and do it the way that you guys are doing it. So you're to be commended as well for this start.
Thank you. And thank you to Project Curate. And please extend my thanks to Matt and to Rachel and others who have helped us, as I said, just crack the door open for future conversation. That was my only hope. I didn't have any hope that we would get to the finish line, but that we would at least begin. Maybe we're rounding that last leg here, and I just pray that we will do it faithfully. So as we started today, we were talking about John Lewis. So I think as we prepare to go, I'll just remind you of those words: if not us, then who? If not now, then when? This is our time, friends. This is the time for the church to be the church. We have got to be the moral compass here. If not us, then who? I don't want to leave it to others. We've got to be responsible and take that mantle on. If you recall, we started this with the theological and ecclesiological interpretation on anti-racism. We've got that unique ability is to continue to bring our theological and ecclesiological lens to this conversation, the Jesus lens, if you will. So we ought not help ourselves. That is who we are. That is in our DNA. That is baked into who we are. So just remind us that this is in fact our time. So as you go today, go disturbed. Go disturbed enough to do something. Go convicted enough to do something. Go passionate, inspired, energized, confident, prophetic enough to do something. Go and be the gospel of reconciliation, of resurrection, of renewal, of love, of compassion and grace. So go and love your neighbor in all that you do, all that you say, and all that you are. I give thanks for all of you. Go in peace. Amen.